Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. According to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability, the employment rate for persons with disabilities currently sits at 62%. While this figure has risen in recent years, up from 59% in the 2017 survey, it's clear that a lot more progress should and could be made in creating more inclusive and accessible workplaces for Canadians with disabilities. We're talking to accessibility experts from across the sector to find out about the challenges and barriers that contribute to this employment gap, along with what nonprofit organizations can do to address these barriers within workplaces, programming, and communities. Joining me to discuss these important issues is David Lepofsky. He's presently a visiting research professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Ontario, formerly a visiting professor of disability rights and legal education at the Osgoode Hall Law School, and for over 3 decades, an adjunct member of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. David also holds volunteer leadership roles in the disability community. He's chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. He's a member and past chair of the Toronto District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee, and David's many awards include investiture in the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, and the Terry Fox Hall of Fame, as well as honorary doctorates from Queen's University, the University of Western Ontario, the Law Society of Ontario, and Brock University. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Great to be here.
In your legal work, your illustrious legal career, you've been involved with a number of transformational legislative changes improving accessibility for people with disabilities. Can you tell us about some of those, please?
Let me be clear that it was outside of my legal career because I worked by day as a Crown lawyer for the Ontario government, so it was volunteer work on the outside. I was involved between 1980 and 1982 in 2 campaigns, one to get disability rights added to the Charter of Rights. We won that. I worked with many others on that, and with the fight to get disability added to the protections of the Ontario Human Rights Code. We won that also in 1982. From 94 to 2005, I led the campaign to get Ontario to pass our country's first comprehensive accessibility law for people with disabilities, called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And I've been involved since then in campaigns all volunteer, aimed at getting that legislation effectively implemented and enforced, which has been sadly quite an uphill battle.
I'm sorry to hear that. Thanks for that clarification. It's really important work you've been doing over the decades. You're currently chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I'd love to hear about some of the important work that organization is doing.
We've been trying to, again, as a volunteer effort, spearhead efforts to get the Ontario government to effectively implement and enforce accessibility for people with disabilities guaranteed in the law. By accessibility, I don't just mean physical accessibility, like being able to get in a building and use the washrooms and get around, but also accessibility, digital accessibility, which is very important to blind people like me, information and communication accessibility, and all other facets of accessibility. We deal with barriers in the workplace, in voting, in transportation, in education is a huge one, in healthcare, and so on, really across the board.
And are there things that Canada is doing well in terms of increasing accessibility, especially in the workplace? I mean, you've just mentioned it's still a challenge. It's hard to get enforcement of these laws. Is Canada doing something right?
I think I could put it this way. There are isolated examples where things are going well, but overall, we are way behind where we should be. We are way behind where the Americans are. There's other countries like Israel, with all of its conflicts, is further ahead in a number of ways than we are. Certain things the European Union is doing that are, ahead of us. The fact is, we are a very affluent, established society. And while we have many challenges, there are societies which have way bigger challenges than us that are doing better than we're doing. We have, in recent years, been enacting more of these accessibility laws. The AODA, Ontario's law, was the first, and since laws have been passed in Manitoba, Nova Scotia, British Columbia, Newfoundland, federally, and so on. But they have been very poorly enforced. And in the case, for example, of the Accessible Canada Act, which I was also involved in advocacy on, the federal government unduly bureaucratized it. We need one-stop shopping enforcement. We have 3 different enforcement agencies, and good luck figuring out who enforces what. Whereas if you went to the US, while there are shortcomings there, they are way more effective at enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So when you cross the border from Canada to the US, you go from Niagara Falls, Ontario to Niagara Falls, New York, or from Detroit to Windsor, you also, from the perspective of people with disabilities, go through a time machine, in the sense of going to the States is going to the future, coming to Canada is like going to the past. And it's embarrassing. It's wrong.
So it certainly is. I wasn't aware of those distinctions. What are some key areas that you think need to be a priority for more progress to be made in Canada?
Well, unfortunately, there are all areas that are kind of equal importance. We need to make our public transportation systems effectively accessible. And we're way behind on that because you can't get to work or to school or to healthcare appointments and so on if you don't have a car. And many people with disabilities live below the poverty line. If public transit is not accessible, you need to have a barrier-free education system because you can't get a good job if you can't get a good education. Well, our school system and our post-secondary system are still replete with accessibility barriers. Even if you need to go to court for justice, our court system is full of barriers. We made public a video earlier last month that documents that a brand new mega courthouse right in the heart of downtown Toronto that cost the public almost $1 billion is in fact $1 billion accessibility bungle. And this video documents all the things they screwed up. And if people immediately might think, well, I guess it would have cost more to do it right. No, we identified barriers which, if they had taken accessibility into account at the design stage the way they should have, it wouldn't have cost, for most of the barriers wouldn't have cost anything to fix or prevent. Or if there was additional cost, it was absolutely marginal, especially when you're spending $1 million on it. So, and all of that feeds into workplaces where people with disabilities are very much disadvantaged in getting access to competitive employment.
Well, I'm glad you turned to the workplace, because in this podcast, we often talk about workplace issues. Charity Village is dedicated to careers in the nonprofit sector, and so that's kind of a natural place where we go to. I'm curious, in a legislative context, are there things you'd like to see changed or updated, or even the failings that you're seeing in terms of the workplace? Is there things that could create better workplace accessibility for Canadians with disabilities?
Well, let me tell you this first, as kind of a headliner. If you go to our website, www.odealliance.org, and everything up there is the result of volunteer efforts, you'll find links to each of these areas. There's a page on employment. Not just a page, it's a page to materials linked to it on employment. There's a page on transportation. There's a page on a web page on healthcare. There's a web page on education, and so on. So you can see detailed proposals, most of which government has not acted on, that we have made over the past couple of decades in each of these areas. Let me talk to you about employment. The starting point is this. The workplace of today, right now, is dramatically different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Where we work, what our actual duties are, The technology and the information technology that we use to do our job, all of those things are significantly different than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And it is a fair prediction that the workplace of 5 years from now or 10 years from now will be dramatically different than it is right now. Let me give you a couple examples. The technology we use in the workplace right now, the computers, the smartphones, and so on, that technology was not available 5 years ago. The stuff that we used 5 years ago is now like a paperweight, right? I mean, it's very outdated. And the tech that we will use in 5 years, it's not only not available, it's not only not purchased, it hasn't been designed yet, right? So if we were to decide, if employers were to decide right now, I want my workplace of 5 years from now to be a barrier-free, accessible place for people with disabilities to work, where the job specifications, the technology, the duties, the venues, the accommodations, all that stuff, the furniture, that will be a barrier-free place. If an employer decides that now, they'll get there because it's an evolving place. They're going to be constantly changing. If you build this into what you plan to do, it will become barrier-free or pretty darn close. If workplaces are moving, it's not unusual with, not only because of distance remote work, but the availability of more and more commercial space. Places it's not unusual to move. If you make a point that the new location you pick is going to be in an accessible venue with accessible washrooms, near to accessible transit and so on, if that becomes part of the planning, then it will happen. But that depends on two things: a commitment and a plan. And actually, a third thing, someone in charge. You need a chief accessibility officer within any organization. Now, if it's a smaller organization, it could be a senior executive with other duties as well. But there needs to be someone where the buck stops, someone who the CEO could turn to and say, what do we got to do to be the conscience, the voice, the evangelist for accessibility? If you do that, you are more likely to get to where you're going. Now, what are the benefits? The benefits are the following. First, it gives you access to a much bigger pool of competitive employees. Because as you mentioned, the stats are people with disabilities are disproportionately unemployed or underemployed. So you got potential workers out there you could draw on. And the last time I checked, any employer wants access to a broader pool of people to employ. Second, employees with disabilities are highly motivated because you get that job, especially when the unemployment rates that we face are so high. You darn well want to do as good as you can. But there's another reason why. Any employer values loyalty of their workplace and employees staying on throughout their career or as long as possible. That creates more efficiency, less training and retraining costs, and it also provides for institutional memory. And any organization, if all your chief executives and all the senior executives leave and new people come in, they got to figure out what the heck was going on. Like there's a lot of loss of institutional memory. Well, the fact is, the employees in the workplace today who have no disabilities are simply people with disabilities in waiting. Because the greatest cause of disability is aging. As you get older, either you acquire disabilities through the aging process, or through illness, or through accidents, or whatever. And so if you've got a workplace that has preventable and removable disability barriers, but they're left in place, then once an employee without a disability becomes an employee with a disability, then they may not be able to stay around. They may not be able to maintain their employment if there are too many barriers. Now, that is a serious legal liability for the company or for the workplace if they don't effectively accommodate. But by providing a barrier-free workplace, you then provide a greater capacity, not only to access a broader pool of potential employees, but you also enable yourself to retain your existing employees much, much longer. And so when it all boils down to, there's every reason to do it, and there's no reason not to do it. The only other thing I'll tell you, just quickly, is some people I think, oh, what does it cost? The fact of the matter is, first, most workplace accommodations, there's studies on this, most workplace accommodations for people with disabilities don't cost much. If some cost more, it's an investment which usually has benefits not only for that worker, but for others. We call it the curb cut effect. When they make a curb cut at an intersection, so you don't have to step down, that's great for people who use wheelchairs, but also people with strollers, baby strollers, people with shopping carts, people with luggage on wheels, and so on. There's all sorts of side benefits. So and the other thing is, if we take this strategy I'm suggesting, which is set about now to plan that your office in the next 5 years is going to be a barrier-free workplace, or as close to it as you darn well can reach, and if you put someone in charge and there's a strong institutional commitment, not just lip service, but a real leadership from the top, then one of the key things you can do is prevent the creation of new barriers. And that costs nothing. That saves money. So the cost thing is not a problem at all. And if you go to YouTube and Google or search on $1 billion accessibility bungle, you can watch our video, either it's 14-minute version or the 49-minute version, and you'll see an illustration of entirely preventable barriers. Every single barrier in that video was created anew with public money when it could have been easily prevented at little or no cost, mostly no cost.
Well, I'll definitely check that out. That's really disheartening to hear. And your I guess in a way it's a challenge, but also your strategy for being effective in creating a more accessible workplace is really really interesting, along with your arguments as to why it's a good reason to do it beyond just being the right thing to do. I'm curious, whether are there common barriers to accessibility that you see in workplaces that that act to limit the participation of people with disabilities? Are there different issues that are coming up again and again?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. There are, I mean, you've got to think of it in terms of two categories. There's the recurring barriers, and then there's the kind of one-off experiences. The one-off experiences are the individual with a distinctive disability that you got to come up with a strategy. So the workplace needs to have two things. If you're listening to this, you're going, what do I do? You say, number one, you want to put in place that commitment to achieve a barrier for work or free workplace, to develop a plan and put someone in charge. That's to address the recurring barriers. More on those in a minute. But the second thing you need is an effective strategy so that if an employee needs a workplace accommodation, so that you've got a process that's non-bureaucratic, swift, and effective. Some places are great at it. Some places just make it a ton of paperwork and attitude and stuff like that. Employers have a duty in law and an interest themselves in creating a welcoming environment in which an individual employee can seek and receive a workplace accommodation. You want to make it clear from day one, if you need it, let us know. We'll figure it out. We'll do our best. And in my experience, and those of others I've talked to, when a workplace wants to accommodate, they can usually figure it out. If they don't want to accommodate it, they can spend a whole lot of creativity coming up with reasons why they got to say no. Do you follow me? So it's typically not whether they can, but whether they will. That's on that side. Now, on recurring accommodations, there's the built environment. So there's where you're located. Did you locate your office in a venue And is the building itself disability accessible? Now, you can't just rely on building codes. Go to our link on the built environment, and you'll see ample, and this video amply documents that a building can be fully building code compliant and yet seriously flawed when it comes to disability accessibility. If you're doing a newer office space, you should engage a disability accessibility consultant, to a qualified one, to give you advice on what to do to maximize accessibility in your office, because we can't expect you to know all this stuff. Your furniture, your choice of office furniture and layout and all that kind of stuff. There's a new trend in workplaces, this hoteling thing where you don't actually get an office anymore. You have to work in a kind of an open area where everybody's there. There's about a million reasons why that's awful. I'm very happy I retired before that became a thing in the Ontario government, or at least a trend. But it also raises all sorts of disability barriers, all sorts of them. And so I mean, it's a bureaucrat solution to a human need, and those typically don't work. But when you're looking at furniture, you're looking at office layout and so on. When you're buying technology for the office, when you are buying software for the office, making sure you get products that are accessible, and where the company that sells them has an accessibility hotline. Some do, some don't. So, I mean, I know some people with vision loss, like me, end up in a workplace, have ended up where, this wasn't my own experience, but I've heard lots of this, where, an employer says, hey, we got new technology, we have new software coming out, and that we're going to start using. And it turns out not to be compatible with a screen reader. So they didn't check before they bought it. I used to, as your introduction said, teach part-time at York University at Osgoode Hall Law School. Well, I had an office up there, which I use sometime, and it had a phone. And they proudly announced at some point that they were installing all new phones, and the new phones were less accessible than the old ones. They had touch screens and so on. And I ended up talking to the CAO of the university. They'd spent a whole lot of money on this without checking to make sure it was accessible. And what they in effect did is gave us new phones that blind people can't use. And there's just no excuse for that. Aside from the fact that it raises all sorts of human rights problems in organizations that are committed to human rights compliance at a policy level. And when you're listening to this, Mary, to some extent, I'm expecting people to think two things. Number one, oh my God, I don't know any of this, and it sounds like it's everywhere. And number two, where do I turn? And let me disabuse people of any worries. Those would be natural worries. I get it. The first thing is, if you have a chief accessibility officer who's actually a chief accessibility evangelist within the organization, you need them to be the ones who can find the answers, or find the consultants who can find you the answers. We don't expect you to know all this stuff. And the second thing is, don't worry about doing everything. Anytime you do anything, it helps. And if you build into your senior leadership team the practice, whenever anybody comes forward with a new proposal saying, hey, how will this work with employees with disabilities? That just constantly building that question. If they expect that question from you before, as a CAO, you even ask it, that gets them to think it through first. And the final thing is, remember that anything that makes your workplace accessible for employees with disabilities and job seekers with disabilities and existing employees without disabilities who later become people with disabilities, it equally makes it accessible for clients or customers with disabilities. The hospital that doesn't have accessible bathrooms creates a problem for their employees, their patients, families, visitors, right? They all use the same washrooms. So you solve multiple problems at the same time when you create an accessible workplace.
I think it's so interesting that you're identifying that it's about a question of having a frame of mind about accessibility that I think is critical for leadership to have, and that you've cited some excellent examples of what happens when they don't, and just how ineffective and money wasting these consequences can be when you ultimately discover that you've not taken them into account, the needs of people who have disabilities. You've said in the past that law needs to change first and changing mindsets can come later. Can you expand on that and how it relates to what you've been identifying as problematic within the workplace and elsewhere?
Okay, it goes like this. The old way people talked on the disability rights movement, including me, in the 70s was to say, my biggest problem is not my blindness. A lot of people would look at me and think, oh, he's blind. That must be a huge problem, which it isn't. But in any event, what we came, and it was revolutionary when I heard others say this and then I adopted it, is to say, look, my biggest problem is my blindness. It's the attitudes of sighted people towards my blindness, the diminished expectations, the stereotypes, the pity, and so on. And the same goes for other disabilities. So back then we thought if the biggest problem is everybody's attitudes towards us, then the solution is to educate the public, raising awareness. That was the big thing. And a lot of people went to town giving inspiring speeches to raise awareness. And what we found was it doesn't work. Yeah, the people laugh at your quippy remarks and so on, and they come out and say that was inspiring and all that stuff, but it doesn't change what people do much of the time. What we found is it's better to change action, and the awareness will follow. In other words, if you set mandatory requirements in law, or if you're a CEO and says, I expect you got a new proposal for us, I want as part of your proposal for you to identify that you've taken into account how people with disabilities, employees, customers, clients will be able to fully participate in it. And you've accommodated that. We're going to have an off-site event. We're going to have an office retreat. Did you pick a venue that's accessible? Oh, you didn't even ask. Well, maybe you should go back and ask before we spend our money there, and let hotels know we don't want to use your premises if it's not accessible. That helps put the pressure on the marketplace to meet these needs. But one of the things that comes from this way of thinking is this. I, as a person with a disability, as a disability rights advocate, I actually do not care why someone removes or prevents a barrier. I don't care why they do, as long as they do. In other words, if they remove that barrier because they heard an inspiring speech and their awareness was raised and they went and changed their practices, great. If they were told they got to change that practice or they're going to get sued, and they didn't want to get sued, and that led them to remove the barrier, look, if that's what made them change their practice, they changed the practice. If they did it just because they want to impress their boss, that's fine by me. If they do it because they just think it's the right thing to do, because intuitively, that's the way you should be, I think that's great also. As long as that barrier is gone, what we find is once the people remove and prevent barriers, that educates them. That raises the awareness. So it's the other way around. Let me give you an example of how, of a specific recurring barrier that potentially every organization listening to this podcast could be affected by. And it's easy to solve tactically or strategically. So not only do we talk about accessibility in buildings, but as I said earlier, we talk about digital accessibility. What does that mean? Software accessibility is one key thing, but also website and web application accessibility and smartphone app accessibility. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, it needs to, these software products need to be designed so that people with disabilities who have particular needs can access them. If you're colorblind, you don't need to identify, when they say, push the red button, that doesn't help someone who's colorblind. If you are, like myself, totally blind, we use screen readers that read what's on the screen if the screen is properly coded. And if the buttons are properly labeled in the tabs and so on. All of those features make the website a better website. So how do you do it? Do I expect CEOs to know how to code for accessibility? Of course not. But what you need to do is say, whoever we're going to hire to do our web content and web design better know how to do accessible web content and web design. And if they don't, they're not going to work for us. Some of them do, some web design folks, and some don't. Just put it in your job spec when you're hiring them, or if you're retaining an outside company to do the work. And right now, if your website has a bunch of accessibility problems, there are IT accessibility experts who can review your site. Don't use automated checkers because they're not reliable. Get someone with expertise to look at it, and they can give you advice on what to fix. Typically, when it comes to websites, this is where web design is so much easier to fix. The web content you created 10 years ago, nobody needs to look at. So even if it's not accessible, if you say, I want to do accessible web design on a go forward basis, you could start posting accessibly. And then when someone comes to do a retrofit, every once in a while organizations do a retrofit. It happens that they could bring in someone who knows how to design an accessible website. They get an IT person with the expertise, and then they can get it right, like from the ground up. And then past problems won't really matter, or they'll become inconsequential. If I go to the website for Best Buy, I don't care about the sale that was on in 2011. I care about the sale that's on right now. And so if their webpage about the 2011 sale still exists, it doesn't matter if I can read it or not. The other thing is that when it comes to web content, I'll give you one example that's totally easy. How many people send documents around and post them online in PDF? Well, PDFs have a lot of accessibility problems. And even though Adobe claims they've got features to fix that, they don't. And the easiest solution is you don't write in PDF. Typically, you write in a program like Word. When you post a document on your website, here's our annual report or whatever, post it in Word and in PDF. If you're sending around key memos to your office, attach them in both. Now, listening to me, people might think, oh, well, we use PDFs so people can't alter them. Well, frankly, they can. There are ways. It takes some effort, but you can. And like for most of the documents, you think about, who cares? It would be fraud, and you'd have the original document to prove it's a fraud. But I've had people say that to me about documents, like, who cares if it's an invitation to a party on Friday at the office at the end of the workday? Like, these are not state secrets that people are going to be falsifying. The worry about people falsifying them is grossly distorted. But either way, you offer it in both Word and PDF if you really need to use PDF. It was already written in Word, probably, or some similar format. And people will have both. So it's just, and it doesn't cost anything to make them available in both formats. But sadly, here in Ontario, if you go to the Ministry of Education, they have all sorts of resources for parents. And there were, last time I checked, like all in PDF, which is a huge barrier for the many parents who can't read PDFs.
Yeah, it's interesting because certainly the way I use PDFs now, it's very easy to modify them. To be honest, there really is no difference in some respects with a soft copy of anything these days. I guess in line with where we were exploring this idea of the law first and mindset later, it would be helpful to know if there are any pieces of upcoming legislation that organizations or individuals should be aware of related to accessibility that's coming down the pipeline.
Well, under Ontario's accessibility legislation, the government can enact a series of accessibility regulations. They've enacted some, and recommendations for reform were proposed by government appointed advisory committees. The current government has done nothing with any of that, but we will continue pushing for that. And whether it's this government or the next government, whoever they are, we're hoping we'll eventually get there. The federal government, under the Accessible Canada Act, has authority to create accessibility regulations setting standards that govern the federal sector. They regrettably haven't passed any of those, which we think is a huge disservice to people with disabilities, but that can be coming. But one thing we did win in the Accessible Canada Act, it's a pale measure by comparison, or a weaker measure by comparison, I should say, but there's a federally appointed body called Accessible Standards Canada. They can't enact enforceable standards, but they can adopt voluntary ones, which may include really good guidelines. They've adopted several, and they're worth looking at, and seeing what more they come out with are also worth looking at. But it's also worth learning about best practices, for example, south of the border, because they are, while they're not perfect, they've come a lot further than we have.
That is really interesting. I wasn't aware that the US was so much further ahead than we are. Maybe it's a consequence of being a more litigious society, that they're being forced to make these changes more quickly or more thoroughly. I guess looking ahead for Canada, do you think there will be significant improvements to accessibility over the next 5 to 10 years? So far, you've mentioned there's an issue around enforceability of some of these laws that are already in place, but I'd like to know what you think needs to happen to create a more accessible future for all Canadians.
Well, let me just take you back a bit. If you want to know kind of why, one of the reasons the Americans are so far ahead is they've got a civil rights tradition. If you go onto Netflix or even, I think, YouTube and search on CRIP Camp, CRIPCAMP, you'll see a fantastic documentary about the amazing leaders of the disability rights movement in the States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was the Obamas, I believe, are behind. They're not in the video, but I think they either produced it or were involved, and it's amazing. Second, it's not a question of enforceability. These laws are enforceable. It's whether the government's prepared to do the enforcement. And that is a huge problem. And you can see the sad story at the AODA Alliance, AODAalliance.org/enforcement. But as for the future, I think you can rest assured that people with disabilities are going to keep fighting and fight even more. And we're coming up with new techniques for doing this, like exposés, like the video about the $1 billion accessibility bungle at the new Toronto courthouse, can pack a lot of punch in terms of having an impact. When I've given, we've done a few such videos. When I've given talks at a couple of times at architecture schools, I look at architecture students and with kind of a big smile, I say, hey, you don't want the buildings you design to end up in one of our videos. And they all kind of laugh nervously. And I use that to try to motivate them to get past the past practices of the existing architect profession. If people want to learn more about this, let me offer just a couple of ideas. One of which is go to our website, because we have a repository of things. We don't just criticize, we offer constructive recommendations. And it's a good resource for that. You can go to AODAalliance.org. If you just want to see the briefs we've submitted, and there are many, you'll see them on our briefs link. The second thing is we put out regular email updates. I write them. They end up on our What's New page, but you can sign up to get those updates. You don't have to be in Ontario, anybody can. Just go to our homepage, AODAalliance.org, skim down to the sign up link, click on it, and paste in your email. And the third thing is follow us on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. And it's at AODA Alliance as we tweet about these things.
Well, we certainly will, and we'll include all those links in the show notes for this episode. David, it's been really a terrific discussion with you. I've learned so much. I want to thank you for your advocacy and the extraordinary work that you've done to improve accessibility and the human rights law, along with your invaluable advice to nonprofits and charitable employers across Canada about how to break down barriers and make their workplaces and their programs and communities more welcoming and accessible. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thanks for including us.
My pleasure.